and welcome to a new episode of When All Is Read and Done. I'm Amy.
And I'm Josh, and this is a podcast where we make sense of the world one book at a time. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you're a regular listener, welcome back.
Before we kick off today's episode, I would like to point out something from our previous episode that has come to our attention as being problematic. So in our last episode, we talked about Helen Huang's The Kiss Quotient, in which the main character has Asperger's syndrome. So naming diagnosis after individuals, as you know, is quite common, such as in Parkinson's or in Alzheimer's disease. However, historians have revealed that Hans Asperger had ties to Nazism and was complicit in euthanasia programs that murdered disabled children. And additionally, how he described the diagnosis is no longer how we understand it today. So we should therefore use autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, instead. And on top of that, using language such as describing ASD as low functioning, mid functioning, or high functioning autism can also be problematic. So thank you so much to our dear friend of ours who pointed this out. And we always appreciate comments like this in helping us be more inclusive as a podcast. So moving on, Josh, do you want to tell us what you have been reading or doing this week?
Yeah, so this week I watched Michael Sheen reciting Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which is a poem by Dylan Thomas, and you can find the video on YouTube. It was really moving. Like the poem might be a little overplayed. Well, I don't know whether a poem can actually be overplayed, but yeah, but hearing it come from an artist as talented as Sheen was really something else. Like I've been trying to read more poems lately, Amy, and recently started reading Post-Colonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz. And I just finished Ocean Vuong's beautiful collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds. And no, before you ask, Amy, I won't be reciting any poems today.
Well, don't shut the idea down. Maybe we could even attract a niche group of listeners that way.
Well, if you want to attract niche listeners, I'll be more than happy for you to do an entire episode in prose. How about that?
Did we commit ourselves to this?
Yeah. Well, we have talked about doing a poetry episode, right? And maybe in that episode, I'll do some poetry. Yeah. But no promises, okay? So what about you, Amy? What have you been reading or doing?
Yeah, so something amazing happened at work this week. One of my colleagues shared our podcast in a wider chat group at work, and suddenly we have so many new listeners. So hello and welcome. Also, this week we hit 500 individual plays, and I'm so grateful. I'm very thrilled about this.
Amy, I'm going to borrow your catchphrase. This is exciting times.
Exciting times. And I'd say we're one step closer to total podcast domination, I would say. So hopefully we will stop receiving those spammy solicitations on Instagram to promote male grooming products soon.
Nah, it's probably going to increase actually.
And anyway, I'm really excited about today's episode, as this is an issue that we both feel strongly about. So do you want to tell us what we will be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. So in conjunction with World Refugee Day, we'll be talking about refugees, their struggles, and what we can do to help in this refugee crisis. I'd like to affirm right here at the top that this podcast stands with refugees, and we acknowledge that refugee rights are human rights. So last week, Amy, I was scrolling through Twitter. Bad idea, I know. And I came across this person who was trying to draw a distinction between the situation in Palestine and the plight of Rohingyas here in Malaysia. And he said Palestinians were staying, fighting, and dying for their territory, whereas Rohingyas had fled Myanmar as refugees at the first sign of opposition. So how do you stop yourself from responding to people like that on Twitter, Amy?
And that's why I don't even have Twitter. And let me guess, did a ton of people agree with this person and creating a whole cesspool of misinformation?
Well, no, actually. Thank God there are actually reasonable people on the internet.
Surprise.
So he was shot down pretty quickly, right? And there are so many things that are wrong with what he said. But I think what really struck me was his response when he was reminded that there are also Palestinian refugees. And he said, can't you tell the difference between migrants with valid documents, referring to the Palestinians, and refugees? So let's pick up where this random Twitter person left off, right? Is there a difference between migrants and refugees? And there definitely is. And conflating the two is what leads to myths like refugees are only in my country to better themselves economically. And I think the key difference between migrants and refugees is the element of choice. Migrants are those who have chosen to move between countries, or sometimes it's to be closer to family or to access better education. Maybe a job opportunity came up, right? And there are numerous reasons why someone would migrate to another country. Refugees, though, don't have the privilege of choice. And the definition of refugees as we know it today has evolved and crystallized following the two world wars. And the 1951 Refugee Convention defines refugees as persons who are fleeing conflict or persecution because they are being persecuted for their race, religion, nationality, because they belong to a particular social group. So those from the LGBTI community, for example, or religious minorities, or because of their political opinions, and they cannot return home because of this persecution. So just try being in those shoes, right? Knowing that you never know when you can return to home because it's too dangerous to do so. And this is why state policy to arrest, detain, and even deport asylum seekers is so troubling. They literally have nowhere safe to return to. And now our xenophobia, let's call it what it is, right, is causing them to be unsafe when they should be receiving refuge. So we will link the text of the 1951 Refugee Convention in the show notes if you would like to learn more about the legal definition of refugees. Full disclosure, I am working with UNHCR. There's an article from UNHCR which discusses the key differences between migrants and refugees.
I'm not sure if you know this about me, Josh. I also sometimes misspeak and say that I was born and bred in Kuala Lumpur. And I also sometimes forget this as well, but I was actually born in Australia. My parents...
I didn't know that.
Oh, really?
This is the first time I'm hearing it.
Yeah, because I sometimes forget this as well, honestly. And my parents were once undocumented migrants in Sydney. Apparently, like this questionable behavior of overstaying in a country in the 80s was not as persecuted as it is now. But there is certainly a distinction between migrants like my parents who moved to Australia in search of economic opportunities in the 80s and refugees who may have arrived in Australia from Vietnam after the war around the same time. So it was a conscious choice that they made without the fear of persecution or war at their tails. And you make an important distinction as well about this privilege of choice and the privilege of returning home. So ultimately, after a couple of years, my parents and, little old me, like we became returning migrants in Malaysia where we were welcomed and we were able to build a life and a family. That's simply a choice that refugees do not have.
And there's this poem titled Home by the brilliant Warsan Shire, where she says, you have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And that perfectly encapsulates a key part of the refugee experience, how dangerous it is, and where fleeing becomes not a choice but a necessity.
This episode is unwittingly turning into a poetry episode, isn't it? But that poem that you shared is perfectly apt to describe the refugee crisis. So before we dive into that, do you want to tell us why forced migration is now termed a crisis? And why is it a point of contention for governments and lay people alike?
Yeah, well, simply put, it is a crisis because of the scale of it. And it can be difficult to grasp just how enormous the refugee crisis really is. There are around 26 million refugees worldwide as we speak. So let the numbers sink in for a moment, right? That's more than the number of people Australia or Taiwan have today. And why is the issue of refugees and why is it such a point of contention? It comes down, I think, either to a lack of information or a lack of empathy. So if we want to be charitable and say it's a lack of information, then I think we have to start at the roots, right? So I've been working with UNHCR for the past 3 years, and the stories that I've heard from refugees and asylum seekers have broken my heart over and over again. I mean, many of them have experienced some of the worst atrocities a person can go through. Like, can you imagine having your loved ones killed or having your home be destroyed or having to lose everything you have and escape to a country which might still decide to put you in a camp or detention center? And still so many of them show remarkable resilience and grace. And it is really humbling to work alongside them and be reminded of the privilege that we take for granted just by virtue of not living in a country that's devastated by conflict. So I can understand, though, that some of us might feel that our situation is far removed from theirs, and it can be further exacerbated, I think, by this pandemic, where us going into our own little silos drives us further from the people that we share our communities with. So for many of us, our ideas of refugees comes either from the images of refugee camps that you have seen in the media, or if you're Malaysian, the Rohingya and Burmese refugees you have probably encountered in your communities. And if you want to learn more about the roots of the refugee crisis, books are a great place to start. So Tan Min Yu's The Hidden History of Burma and David Amos' A Savage Dreamland devote chapters on how the Burmese Tatmadaw or armed forces are systematically massacring Rohingyas in Rakhine State and forcing them to flee to Bangladesh and beyond. But the largest refugee displacement right now, though, are the Syrians.
Mhm.
So if you would like to learn more about the Syrian crisis, we would link to a Book Riot article by Karim Shaheen, which lists 12 books that explore the devastation of the war started by Bashar al-Assad. And we've shared before how important own voices authors are. And 2/3 of the authors on that list are Syrians, so do check them out.
Yeah, you've mentioned the Rohingya and Syrian refugees, and these are refugees movements that have really dominated the newsfeed in recent years. However, people have been displaced for centuries, right? And it's just, the face of the refugee crisis always evolves. So the Russian Revolution, the Armenian Genocide, the Spanish Civil War, the Cuban Revolution, and certainly World War II as well. These are some of the biggest historical crises that have resulted in huge population movement due to conflict and persecution. So in preparing for this episode, I wanted to pick up a book that really demonstrates how long-standing refugee crises have been in our societies. So ignorant people like the one that you've described on Twitter may paint refugees with the same brush, isn't it? Like simply as foreigners whom we have nothing in common with, invading our land. But historically and even currently, refugees are European, Asian, Jewish, South and Central American. And in recent years or so, we've seen an increase of climate refugees from the Pacific Islands, a region where like whole nations are literally disappearing due to environmental stressors. So for this episode, I've picked up a collection of short stories called The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, edited by Viet Thanh Nguyen. As you may know, is the Pulitzer Prize winner of The Sympathizer.
I actually didn't know that. So I've never heard of this book before. It's a good thing we're doing this podcast, right? I learn something new every week or every 2 weeks, let's say.
Yeah, and Nguyen, he's one of the most intelligent, eloquent, and as well as like versatile writers of both fiction and nonfiction. I love his perspective on things, immigration, politics, culture, and of course, refugees. And we can link one of his latest interviews on BBC Book and Authors in our show notes. So Nguyen himself, he was born to refugee parents who fled from North to South Vietnam. And they found themselves displaced once again to the United States after the fall of Saigon in 1975. So I found this book deeply moving right from the start, where he opens the book up with these displaced persons are mostly unwanted where they fled from, unwanted where they are, in refugee camps, and unwanted where they want to go. So it draws again to the point that you made about refugees and migrants, Josh, where no one would willingly put themselves, their loved ones, their children in this position. So no one would choose to be dehumanized or leave their family and friends and homes and possessions, everything behind. And beyond that, like refugees also leave behind their language, their culture, and their way of life. So this collection was carefully curated to represent refugees from Afghanistan, Chile, Zimbabwe, and the former Soviet Union, and many more. This really puts into perspective just how diverse refugees communities are, their circumstances, the country of origin, and where they ultimately end up. So they're definitely not a monolith, and the language that we use has to reflect this diversity as well. Maybe perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but why is it when we talk about the current refugee crisis, we're always hearing a US or a European perspective, like as if this is an issue that other countries have created, and now these high-income countries, they have to quote unquote deal with. Like, is it because most of these countries had a part to play, whether, colonization or destabilization of these countries where refugees are from in the first place? Or is it because high-income countries are where most refugees end up resettling in?
Well, I think the main reason we think of the refugee crisis as an American or European one is because it's where the headlines are being generated. So America is building the wall to keep out, among others, asylum seekers, right? We've heard that thousands of times.
Yeah.
Or we hear European countries say their resources are stretched to breaking point because of having to accommodate refugees, or are coming up with laws to forcibly move asylum seekers to third countries. So that's the prevailing narrative. So yes, Turkey is hosting almost 4 million refugees, the most of any country in the world, as a direct result of a deal which it signed with the European Union, where Turkey has received up to 6 billion euros in the financial assistance since 2016 in exchange for taking back asylum seekers from Europe. But still, this is far from a European issue, right? And shouldn't be framed as such, especially when you take into account that after Turkey, the countries hosting the most refugees are Colombia, Pakistan, and Uganda. And that the largest refugee camp in the world is in Kutupalong, in Bangladesh, right? Lebanon has the highest number of refugees per capita.
Yep.
And when we look at the big picture, innovation in how refugee issues are being handled have developed outside of Europe. So in Central America, for example, both Mexico and Belize have promoted refugee self-sufficiency and local integration projects to aid development in the poorest areas of the countries, like the Yucatan Peninsula and the Valley of Peace. Or over in Africa, Uganda, which hosts 1.4 million refugees, is a great example of what can happen when a state has the political willpower to provide rights and autonomy to refugees. So Uganda doesn't have refugee camps, right? Instead, in rural settlements, refugees are provided with plots of land for personal and commercial agriculture, and they take part in market activities. And when you move to the cities, refugees can start businesses and gain employment. That is huge, especially when you consider many countries, such as Malaysia, do not allow refugees to work. How do you sustain yourself and your families without work? And imagine the kind of exploitation that takes place when people are desperate to survive, right? Providing refugees with the right to work and socio-economic opportunity has contributed to the Ugandan national development. Now, it doesn't mean the refugees in Uganda do not face discrimination from the local populace at all, right? Still, by building on their self-reliance strategy, Uganda has provided a beacon for how the refugee crisis can be approached away from the current European model.
Yeah, absolutely. Framing the refugee crisis from a European perspective completely overlooks the fact that most refugees are currently seeking asylum in developing countries. So I want to come back to the tweet that you opened up the episode with. So this not only demonstrates blatant ignorance, but also a complete lack of empathy for refugees' plight. So this may be because people think that the subject is too far removed from their realities. A lot of people have the misconception that political conflicts that descend into like straight out violence can only happen in impoverished nations, but they may not be aware of just how close they can find themselves to be in a similar situation. So in November of last year, a military conflict broke out in the Tigray region in Ethiopia that has resulted in over 1 million people being displaced. So this is a country that has never been colonized and is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa. And it's astounding to think that only 2 years ago, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, he won a Nobel Peace Prize for ending a 20-year war between Ethiopia and neighboring Eritrea. So when he first came into power, he was seen as this liberal politician, right? He freed political prisoners, he relaxed press freedom, and was seen as a bastion of hope for progressive politics in the region. However, last year, amidst the pandemic and in a move to consolidate power, his government blocked parliamentary elections due to COVID and has now unleashed military forces on his opposition. So I don't know, Josh, like a government using COVID as a front to stifle political opposition and to hang on to power. I don't know. It sounds awfully, awfully familiar to me. And it's like a chapter that's just like lazily copied out of the authoritarian playbook. I just wanted to use this as an example to highlight just how quickly a stable country can slide into conflict and violence, and to reiterate the fact that no one chooses to be a refugee, and perhaps we can approach this subject with a little more empathy.
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial. And I think Ethiopia really is a really, really good example, right? And I think the final point I would like to raise in this episode is really what we started with, that refugee rights are human rights. So one of the projects that I'm most proud to be working on is an online safe space project, which was born out of the pandemic and lockdown last year. Refugee women leaders wanted to create a safe space where their community members could meet virtually and speak about the stresses that they are encountering due to lockdown. And they have been bravely persevering through these sessions, all while living with the threat of being detained whenever they leave their homes and being without the right to work to sustain themselves. And really, Amy, working with them gives me hope that we can work towards building an equitable future for them and their families, one where they have dignity and they are treated with empathy, like you mentioned. So these refugee women, they are not only looking to preserve their right to life and protection, right? Their children have a right to birth registration and education and healthy food. The elderly have the right to healthcare. Members of the LGBTQI community have a right to be free from harassment and discrimination and sexual assault. See, the truth of the matter is this: refugee rights are intersectional in nature. And it's so easy for us to other them, to think of them as a class apart, especially if we fail or refuse to see them in our society or see ourselves in them. So if you say that you stand against racism, exploitation, or discrimination in all its forms, then you should be standing with refugees too.
Yeah, so for World Refugee Day, it's so important for us to put out this episode, as books are such a great tool, not only for education, but also for empathy and humanizing a community of people that can easily be swept away in statistics. An extremely human book that I will be recommending for today's Rat Rack is Thi Bui's graphic novel memoir, The Best We Could Do. I feel like we're breaking new ground here. So I'm recommending a graphic novel before you do. Yeah, so Thi Bui's story starts off as one ordinary American woman adjusting to life as a first-time mother. The story then transports us to a time where her family is escaping Vietnam and temporarily seeking asylum in Malaysia before resettling in the US. And I highly, highly recommend this.
I just started reading it.
So, very nice. Yeah. Can I also say that I'm really surprised that you haven't already mentioned Monstrous by Marjorie Liu,
look, if I mention Monstrous again, this podcast will have to be retitled When All Is Read and Done and Monstrous.
when all is when all is monstrous and done. Yeah, so I think this book is easily one of the best graphic novel that you've recommended to me and our listeners, like way back in episode 1.
Hey, all my recommendations are the best.
Well, this is a stunning graphic novel set in warring nations, and it depicts political violence, genocide, and what is essentially a refugee crisis. So did I just make 2 graphic novel recommendations in one episode? I think your influence on me is growing with each episode.
Yeah. I only believe that the day you finally accept Squirrel Girl for the kick-ass superhero that she is. For anyone who's interested in big picture refugee issues and some possibilities in how the refugee crisis can be rethought, I highly recommend Refuge by Alexander Betts and Paul Collier. So they move beyond an Eurocentric approach to highlight best practices from around the globe. The Central American and Ugandan examples, which we have talked about in this episode, are drawn from that book. I also have a couple of Beyond the Books recommendations. This World Refugee Day, there is so much that we can do to support the refugee communities where we are, right? Refugees are a global issue, that's true, but refugee protection is local. And my hope is that we can all do our part in making this world one that is more accepting and inclusive for refugees and asylum seekers. One simple way we can do that is to debunk many of the myths floating around about refugees with families and friends. Myths like, their presence increases crime rates, that they create a burden on the welfare system, or that they are only here to seek better jobs. You could also consider donating to NGOs who are doing extraordinary work supporting refugee communities around you. So if you are in the Klang Valley, MSRI, Dignity for Children Foundation, and El Shaddai all do amazing work with refugee children, providing them not just with access to education, but also connecting them with services to meet any urgent needs that they might have. So I'm proud to be working alongside them in my role with UNHCR, and we'll provide links to their websites in our show notes if you would like to find out more about the work that they do.
Yeah, if you're in the UK, you might want to think about how you can help through volunteering, donating goods, services, and also money to the British Red Cross, Refugee Action, or Save the Children. This was such an enlightening episode, Josh. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and also, of course, for all the work that you do for your community.
If you like this episode, subscribe to When All Is Read and Done on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you would like to support us, please rate, review, or share this episode with a friend or loved one. Especially, if you feel that they would like to know a little bit more about refugees, I think this would be a great episode to share with them. And it would really help our little podcast grow and reach new listeners.
Yeah, we would also love to hear your feedback and comments on this episode or any topics that you would like us to cover in future ones. You can reach us on Instagram at redanddone or via email at redanddonepod@gmail.com. Until next time then.
Bye.